G'day Bodgies and Widgies and welcome back to the channel. Today I'd like to present the most comprehensive care guide you'll see about the Oscar cichlid. These fish have been in the aquarium hobby for decades at this point, and over that period of time there's been a lot of changes in the way that we keep these fish. And online, if you ever read up on a care guide, you'll find that there's a lot of conflicting information between different sources. And to go along with that, there's over a dozen different Oscar strains and a few different species that you can keep in the aquarium hobby as well, which can get kind of overwhelming if you wanted to know what all the differences are. So today I'm going to really break down everything you need to know before you get your very first Oscar. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you watching this video are going to be new to the channel, so I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Bodgie, I'm an Australian aquarium YouTuber, and I also am an avid aquarium enthusiast. I have a whole range of different aquariums, and I document that through this channel. If you end up enjoying this video, I would highly appreciate if you did want to give it a thumbs up, and you have the option to consider subscribing to the channel as well. But I say enough talking about me, let's have a look at some Oscars. So Oscar cichlids are native to South America, and they're pretty much found from one end of the continent all the way down to the other end. And they find themselves in all three of South America's main water systems, being clear water, black water, and white water systems, which goes to show just how widespread these fish are. They're also incredibly hardy, and they can tolerate a wide range of parameters, and they also breed very, very rapidly. So it really does make them a pretty essential or keystone species in the South American ecosystem they're from. Oscar cichlids also are a ready food source for the people that live along the rivers of South America, but they also act as a great middle ground predator that keeps the populations of smaller fish in check, but also acts as a ready source of prey for those larger South American monsters like red-tailed catfish and arapaima. Because of how widespread these fish are, there are potentially up to 7 different species of Oscars, but this is a topic that's been up for debate since like the late 1800s, and right now there are mainly 3 recognized species, being the Astronotus crassipinus, Astronotus mccolgi, and the most recognized and common of all, the Astronotus ocellatus. And the reason there's so much debate around how many species there are is because these fish, because of how widespread they are, often have regional variants. So the same species that looks different just depending on the area that it's from. And a clear example of this is a fish like the Astronotus orbicularis, I believe, which is just believed to be the Astronotus crassipinus. You can see how it gets confusing, but they're believed to be the same fish. They just look slightly different because they're from different locations. But in the aquarium trade though, 95% of the time, the main species you'll encounter is your Astronotus ocellatus, also known as the common tiger Oscar. Now, the Astronotus ocellatus would have entered the aquarium hobby around about the 1930s timeframe, so they've been in the aquarium hobby for a damn long time. And over that period, they've earned the name Tiger Oscar because of their coloration and their patterning. But one could argue that the behaviors of wild Oscars are truly tiger-like, with their slow movements, calculated behavior, and their pretty intense predatory instinct. But that just goes into all of the different factors as to why these fish have been loved for so long. Oscar cichlids also get big, like 45 centimeters or 1.5 feet big. And whilst that might seem a little bit hard to believe because most of the time that you see Oscars, they're around that 25 to 30 centimeter mark, with enough time and space, they genuinely will reach that size. And even when you see an Oscar over 30 centimeters or a foot long, you really do pause and do a double take and be like, hold on a second, that Oscar is absolutely huge. So it puts into perspective just how big these fish can get. But before we get into all of that, the do's and don'ts and the max sizes and all those specs, let's actually start from the very beginning of when you might get your first Oscar. Now, almost 99% of the time, you'll go to an aquarium store and see this little tiny 5 centimeter Oscar with its big beady eyes and its puppy dog personality coming up to the glass and acting all crazy and voracious, which makes them a very easy fish to impulsively purchase. But the speed these fish grow is absolutely crazy. In their first year of life, it's perfectly normal for an Oscar to reach 20-25 centimeters and easily 35 centimeters within their first 2 years of life. What's even more crazy is these fish can live up to 15 years, potentially even 20 years with enough of the right conditions and space. And the reason I'm emphasizing this so much is because their aquarium size really plays a massive part in the long-term care of these fish. A lot of online care guides I see recommend that an Oscar can be kept at a bare minimum of 55 gallons or 200 liters, and personally I think this is kind of nuts. The size these fish get to, the activity they have, and also the level of messiness they have as well really doesn't make them suitable for such a small environment. You're going to be constantly experiencing swings in water parameters, ammonia, nitrate, nitrites, and also just things like temperature, and the space that this fish will utilize in such a small environment probably isn't the most humane thing to do as well. Now, what I think would be a much better alternative, and something that's probably a lot more practical long-term to keep these fish, is a 120-gallon aquarium. This provides you ample space for a single Oscar, along with a bunch of other tank mates if you wanted to keep them with tank mates as well. It's also going to be a lot more stable of an environment with a lot more bigger leeway for those parameter swings you might experience as well. Now, I currently have a group of 5 wild Oscars in my 5-foot, 150-gallon aquarium, but just in about 2 months, they are getting upgraded to a 350-gallon system. And whilst we're on the aquarium system, let's quickly talk about some of the equipment that you'll need in order to sustain these fish. Filtration is going to play a massive part in the success of you keeping Oscars. When you hear these fish being messy, that really is true. Whenever you see Oscars feed, they often crumble up their food and release little bits of food dust through their gills, and all of that is just additional waste if you don't have anything to clean that up with. So having ample biological filtration to break down the ammonia these fish produce is going to be absolutely vital. There are 2 main best methods of filtration when it comes to keeping Oscars, and I reckon those would be a canister filter or a sump. Now, I would personally pick a sump over a canister filter just because you've got a lot more space to play around with when it comes to the filtration. The one thing that I'd also recommend with Oscars is to have a lot more mechanical filtration than you think you'll need. These fish, as I mentioned before, will be incredibly messy, and after feeding, there'll just be a storm of little food particulates in the water. So having something like filter floss, filter slocks, or even a filter roller in a sump was just going to make your life so much more easier. I currently have an inbuilt sump in this aquarium, and it's pretty compact as a method of filtration. It's pretty lame in my opinion, so I cannot wait to have these fish upgraded into that new aquarium with a absolutely amazing sump. In terms of other equipment, you'll need a heater as well, considering these are a tropical fish. The temperature range can go anywhere from 24 to 28 degrees, and I personally like keeping them on the warmer end of around 26 to 27, just because I find that their activity, their colors, and their metabolism is a lot better. They're not going to be as sluggish when you keep them in warmer water compared to cooler water parameters as well. Optionally, you can also add a wave maker into your aquarium. Oscars can handle and will actually quite like a bit of flow in their tank. Plus, it's just going to help provide them some enrichment, something to work against, and help with keeping your aquarium nice and clean. The main thing to remember is that your canister filter or sump can provide some flow, but it may not be optimal all the time. Where I'd recommend a wave maker is going to be absolutely amazing is if you're noticing some detritus collecting in your aquarium, then have a wave maker in there and just make sure that it's getting all of that flushed out into your filtration, so you're avoiding any unnecessary buildup of nitrates. Now let's talk about the aquarium setting itself, and this is where you've got a lot of playroom when it comes to keeping Oscars, but I would definitely recommend to have some sort of aquascape, because these fish really like moving things around, picking things up, and making their environment suitable for their personal requirements. And there's not a lot that you need to do to give them that additional enrichment. I personally like to give them a sandy substrate, a bit of driftwood, and some smooth river rocks. You can also give them some big terracotta caves to hide in and have some security. But again, there's a lot of play around that you can do with their environment. The one thing that I would say to avoid is anything sharp or potentially obstructive. Oscars are clumsy and like pretty stupid when it comes to just swimming around. They easily bump themselves into things, scrape themselves, cut themselves, and you'll almost always see one of your Oscars with a torn fin or a missing scale. That's how bad they are. So you just want to avoid stuff like, sharp bits of wood, because it will just lead to higher risk of injury. You can also keep your Oscar cichlids with plants. The only thing is just avoiding those fine leaf plants like Embulia, but you can keep them with nice rough plants like Anubias, Java fern, Vallisneria, and even some of those chunkier stem plants like Wisteria as well. And another great alternative is to have some immersed plants like pothos or peace lily, where those roots can come into the aquarium and really suck up all of the nitrates, but also just provide a really nice natural way of cover for your Oscars as well. The final thing to keep in mind is pH. Now, I'm not a pedantic pH checker, and Oscars can really range in the pH that they can be kept at, but I think that a relatively good, safe threshold to keep these fish nice and happy is probably from around 6 to 7.5 in the pH range, and that's probably very achievable for a lot of you out there. It's just your standard water parameters when it comes straight out of your tap, so that's really all I do. Now let's go over the behavior of Oscars, because there's a lot to unpack here. Oscars are a predatory fish by nature, but they definitely fall into that more calculated, slower moving, ambush predator approach. You'll often see them in the wild under overhangs of fallen driftwood, where they can use all of the darkness and the shadows to their advantage, but they'll just sit there waiting for prey to swim past and attack them. But that also doesn't mean they won't chase after potential prey either. Oscars also have such an immense range of emotional variation, which makes it kind of hard to pinpoint whether an Oscar will be super aggressive or not. I've seen Oscars be kept with fish much smaller than themselves and they'll be super nice and peaceful, but I've also seen Oscars be absolutely relentless and just hate anything and everything that they're being kept with, but for the most part these fish are relatively docile. Oscars tend to learn and associate behaviors from their environment really well. So if you're keeping your Oscars in an aquarium where you're giving them a lot of live feeders, or you're keeping them with a lot of aggressive fish, they are going to be a lot more ruthless, because being aggressive is their key way to survive. I definitely tend to take the more pacifist approach when it comes to raising Oscars. The only real aggressive fish I have in this aquarium are my trio of Calberry peacock bass, but even then they're a lot more laid back, very much like the Oscars, and just attack food when it goes in. And when it comes to food, I just give them prepared food, so there's no real reason for these fish to display aggression or to hunt after things or to fend for themselves. The one thing I have faced though is whenever I add anything silver or shiny fish-wise into this aquarium, they just unlock some sort of intense predatory instinct and will absolutely harass that fish to death. I am speaking from personal experience here. And this sort of primal hunting instinct really gets amped up when you keep multiple Oscars together. They act as like hype men for each other, so when one fish attacks something, they all chime in and attack something, so a lot of damage can be done in a very short period of time. So again, they're mostly peaceful, but they can do a lot of damage when they want to. And in general though, you can keep your Oscar with a range of different tank mates. As long as they're hardy and they sort of tend to stay out of the Oscar's way, that will be a perfect option to consider. Great examples would be those larger Central and South American cichlids like peacock bass, piercei, vieja, red devils, geophagus, and anything that gets to that 25 to 30 centimeter mark, perfectly great. Along with that, catfish, fantastic consideration. Stuff like driftwood catfish, Raphael catfish, plecos, all great options to consider. The one thing that I will recommend now as sort of personal bias is to try and keep your Oscars in a group. It's really a lot more fun. You see a lot more of their playful behavior come out. Seeing them interact and squabble and play with each other is just super fun. And it's something that I probably will always do moving forward to keep my Oscars in a trio, if not more. And considering these fish are a communal species as well in the wild, where they often can be found in shoals, I think keeping them in a group will often make them focus their aggression towards each other as they try and sort out their pecking order, and that way you could probably get away with some other tank mates which could potentially be risky, but either way it'll just stop the Oscars from showing their aggression to everyone around them and more so towards themselves. Now, what's probably the most recognized behavioral trait about Oscars is their pouty nature, and I think that's something that you often see a lot in captive bred Oscars. These fish really love to show off when they're upset. They go all lazy and washed out and discolored up in a corner, just hanging out like they absolutely hate life, and you'll think that your Oscar is probably on the verge of death. And then you come back an hour later and you will see it absolutely loving life right at the top of the glass, like it's waited to see you its entire life. My wild Oscars though aren't like this. They have a lot more shyer, predictable nature, which I find quite interesting. If they're upset, they'll sort of dart and become a really tight group. They'll just huddle all together. And then once they're happy, or whatever threat they got scared about weirdly is gone, they'll just sort of break apart and do their own thing in different parts of the aquarium. And that's just the repeat that happens every single time. What's fun now is that there are over a dozen different Oscar strains in the aquarium hobby, and it feels like there's a new one coming out every month, especially in recent times. What I'll do is break down these strains, let you know how they might look like when they mature, whether they'd be worth getting, and which ones to avoid, because it can be very overwhelming considering how many options are available. We'll start off with the classics, and at number 1, let's have a look at the Tiger Oscar. The Tiger Oscar is the mascot for the Oscar cichlid. These fish have an abundance of red to orange scales that run from head to tail in a mottled pattern. The black and red contrasting color is just amazing, and the thing to keep in mind here is that juveniles might not have that much red, but it's something that emerges with age. So these fish are definitely an awesome consideration to get, considering they have been in the aquarium hobby for decades. Number 2 is the red or copper Oscar. I'm bundling these up together because they're often sold as the same fish, and I'll explain the difference. These fish are the same strain with minor color variations. The red Oscar has basically the red coloration through the entire body. There's no patterning. The only black that's present is across the face and the fins. Copper Oscars are exactly the same as this, but instead of the red, the body tends to be a more orange rusty tone. But it's very, very rare that you'll see copper Oscars and red Oscars be sold separately. Number 3 is the black Oscar. Now sometimes this can refer to a totally jet black melanistic Oscar like you see with a Dark Knight Ram, but often it refers to an Oscar with little to no red at all. They might look like a wild Oscar, and I actually do have one of these in my group of 4 or 5 Oscars. I've got 4 wilds, like true wilds, and 1 wild type Oscar. The main way you can tell these apart from wild Oscars is their abnormal patterning. My Oscar, for example, has these black tiger-like stripes, whereas wild Oscars have a more random body, but with natural patterning that you see similar across the rest of the wilds. The captive Oscars also tend to have a more spoon-shaped head with a deep curve and stockier body. Number 4 is the mosaic tiger Oscar. Now these fish are an Oscar that's up for debate. So mosaics are basically normal tiger Oscars, but the juveniles have crazy intricate patterning. However, I find that the pattern doesn't really age that well. As the Oscar gets bigger, the patterning also gets thicker and often merges together just to look like a slightly more red tiger Oscar. And for the often high price these fish sell at, I personally don't really see it being worth it. What I'd much rather do is just get a group of normal tiger Oscars and just see how different their pattern emerges as they mature. Well, hello, I realize that I probably look very, very different to me in the rest of this video. Basically, for whatever reason, Oscar number 5 and 6, the footage just disappeared. I don't know where it is, but I feel like I did record it. But anyways, let's continue. Oscar number 4, is it Oscar number 4? Is it? No, it's Oscar number 5. See, this is what happens when you film 3 weeks later. Oscar number 5 is the albino or leucistic tiger Oscar. The albino tiger Oscar is probably the second most popular Oscar. Their inverted colors create the super cool contrasting white and red fish, and the reds tend to be one level higher in these fish, which looks totally amazing. Now, it's been up for debate for many, many years whether these are albinos or leucistics, but to be honest, they all look the same, so tomato, tomato, I'm not really too fussed. They're cool fish either way. Number 6 is the albino red Oscar. Just like the normal red Oscar, these fish have a solid red through their body with just the face and the fins being white. And in these fish, the coloration actually tends to be a lighter orange, closer to the copper Oscar than it is an actual red coloration. Number 7 is the lemon Oscar. Now, these were probably the first real, unique and different Oscar strain that came into the aquarium hobby aside from the albinos. We had albinos for a long time, but when the lemon Oscar came in, it was like, hold on a moment, there are yellow Oscars now? So as the name suggests, the lemon Oscar does have this really cool yellow patterning that runs from head to tail. Again, sort of like the albino red Oscar, they have just white patches through the face and the fins. You can also often find yellow or lemon tiger Oscars, but the thing to consider with both of these different variations is the yellow coloration can be muted as the fish tends to age. And that might be exactly what you're after, but if you're looking for a high contrast fish, these might not be the fish for you. but also it really does come down to genetics and quality, because I have seen some really yellow mature lemon Oscars, and that's where the gamble really comes in. Number 8 is the albino or white Oscar. Now these fish are really not all that common. The white Oscar is just a solid white from head to tail with no red patterning anywhere. Sometimes there might be the odd red scale or the eye spot, but that's about it. And really, I think these fish look absolutely stunning. When you find a true white Oscar that's just white from head to tail, they look super ghostly and almost angelic at the same time. I love the dynamic that you can get between these fish. Number 9 is the chili red Oscar. These are basically the same as the mosaic tiger Oscar, but what's really cool in the chili reds is their vibrancy of red. It truly is a red compared to all the other strains, which tend to be orange. We call them red, but they really are a shade of orange. With chili reds, it's actually red, which is super cool. But again, these have the same risk as the patterning merging together and just sort of becoming a standard or solid mass as the fish matures. But I kind of reckon it's worth it because you get a white and red fish instead of a white and orange fish. Number 10 is the super red Oscar. Now, the super red Oscars are a fiery red or orange from head to tail, and sometimes they have a splash of white through the face, but these Oscars look awesome when they're full grown and are really just a bold addition of color to your South American or Oscar aquarium. Sometimes they're sold as super red chili Oscars, but any play on the name like super red chili, chili super red, it all just refers to the same fish at the end of the day. Number 11 is assorted longfin or veiltail Oscars. I'm calling these assorted because there really is a longfin option for all of the strains of Oscar that I've mentioned so far. Now, I would try and refrain from getting these Oscars for a few different reasons. The main one being their inability to swim properly. Having such long, delicate fins doesn't really give these Oscars the same level of propulsion or swimming capability that leads to these fish exerting a lot more energy than they need to. Along with that, I see these fish having a lot more fin deformities, especially towards the tail, where there can be a really obvious kink or bend. They also have a much higher risk of being picked on by other tank mates or their hardscape, which can cause damage to the fins, and that just opens up a lot more risk for infection or ill health. Number 12 is the assorted short body Oscar, and again, these are assorted because there's a short body for almost every Oscar strain mentioned before. Now, I'd try and avoid these full stop. These Oscars are genetically defective in simple terms, and not only do they have shorter lifespans, but also a much higher risk for internal issues, and funnily enough, they're a lot more expensive compared to any other Oscar strain, which is just kind of stupid because you're paying for an unhealthy fish for a lot higher of a price. Now, basically with these short body Oscars, what happens is the organs of the fish grow to the same size that a normal tiger Oscar or standard Oscar would grow to, but the body is a lot more compact. So these organs are being crushed and forced up against each other. There's a lot of weird bone defects, and it really just does lead to a fish living a very poor quality of life, and I just find it a little unethical, that's all. Number 13 is the assorted designer names. Recently, there's been this big trend in the aquarium hobby of really crazy designer names being given for albino Oscars, which are pretty much just chili reds, but they have different plays on the name, and they might have, maybe the slightest bit more red or the slightest bit more intricate patterning, but they could be triple or quadruple the price of a standard chili red, fetching for up to $150 Australian, which could be a lot more depending on where you live. Strains like the Nemo Slayer, Chili Pepper, Pepper Chili, all of those plays on the names are pretty much the same fish, and I'd recommend you think twice before getting them because you might be paying an exorbitant amount for a marginally better looking fish. The main thing to do whenever these new fancy strains come out is to try and find photos of adults of these fish, or maybe just to wait a couple of months. Oscars are a fish that have a very high turnover rate in the aquarium hobby. They're almost always being rehomed, and I will almost guarantee that you'll find one of these fancier named strains for sale a couple of months down the line, and you'll be able to gauge what they look like when they're mature, so that way you can pick them up then when they're slightly bigger, or get a smaller one, and you'll be able to know what it will look like when it gets a little older. Number 14, the wild Astronotus ocellatus, and now we get into the wild Oscars. Now, my group has 4 Astronotus ocellatus or wild tiger Oscars, and these fish tend to look so different compared to captives. They're much longer, they have a thinner profile, and they have much more smoother features like the head curve, which is a perfect crescent instead of a spoon-like dip. The colors are also a lot more different. As juveniles, these fish have crazy intricate copper-like patternings and lines, which I really wish that stayed, but eventually they get into this more grey adolescent phase where there's a lot more of a blue tinge. Their patterning becomes a lot more solid and predictable. However, these fish go through another color change as they reach sexual maturity, and they get a lot more contrast, so it's really fun just observing the way that these fish age. Number 15 is the Astronotus crassipinnis. Now, I think for Oscar enthusiasts, this would be the dream fish to own. The bumblebee Oscar just looks so good with their black and yellow patterning as juveniles. Now, they do grow out of these colors, but when they mature, they look just as good in my opinion. Their solid black and earthy yellow barring with a mild red speckling is just truly beautiful. And these fish are pretty hard to come by, and they can fetch a pretty high price depending on where you are in the world. In Australia, they go as high as $150 each, but that's a price that I am totally willing to justify the next time they come up for sale. As a matter of fact, I actually went to my aquarium store, my local aquarium store, when they were selling wild Oscars because the import was actually bumblebee Oscars or Astronotus crassipinnis, but the wrong fish was sent, and that's how I ended up with my Astronotus ocellatus. So it'll happen one day. I can just hope. Last but not least, number 16 is the wild Oscar Macaulay or Macaulay. I'm going to call them Macaulay because I think the J is silent, but if you know, please let me know in the comment section down below. Now, these fish are very fresh off the boat. They were only described as a species back in 2022, so very recent, and I feel like there's only a handful of people keeping them in aquariums around the world. So again, if you are keeping them, I'd love to know, especially if there are any differences in behavior. But these fish have a much darker color palette with just some very mild barring that runs across the body, and they do have red spots that runs from head to tail. I personally feel like they look a lot more delicate compared to the other Oscar species and strains. They just have a softer, cuter look to them, and I personally love the way that they look. So that should pretty much cover all the types of Oscars that you will encounter in the aquarium hobby, both now and well into the future. And what's great about all of these fish is their care requirements are pretty much one and the same. These fish are very hardy and very adaptable to a wide range of parameters, and even with wild Oscars, they tend to grow out of their shyness, especially when it comes to feeding time. And on that topic, let's talk about the food. Feeding Oscars is probably the most fun thing to do when it comes to keeping these fish because they eat food super well and they are super voracious when they start feeding. Now, generally the best food to give Oscars to offer them that real good complete diet is just a high quality protein pellet. Now, generally I feed Extreme Aquatic Foods or Vitalis, but I've also recently been trying out a brand called Frenzy Fish Feeds, which is Australian, and that stuff's been pretty good as well. I mainly just avoid anything with a lot of fillers and look for foods that have a really good protein content and offer a different range of ingredients, and along with that you can supplement their diet with some fresh foods and even fruit like blueberries. They will love blueberries, and it's a really good way of giving them some vitamin C. The one thing I'd say to avoid is just any crumbly food because, like I mentioned earlier in this video, Oscars, they feed like a 1-year-old. They will take food into their mouth, move it around, crumble it up, and little bits of food dust will just come flying out of their gills. But the way that Oscars feed really does give you a good gauge of how much food to give them. With Oscars, they tend to collect as much food as they can in their mouth, run off into a corner, and then just start like processing it slowly. So I will basically throw in a handful of pellets into this aquarium. They'll all go stuff their faces, go off somewhere. That gives time for all of the other fish to have their filling, and I probably won't feed the Oscars more than that. I might give them a little bit more or a little bit less depending on how much they've eaten that day. So a very easy way of gauging how much to feed them: give them enough food, they'll tell you when they're enough, and they'll just start eating all the food they have in their mouth. Now, if you've got your Oscars in a group in a large enough aquarium with clean water and enough food, eventually they're going to start pairing off and breeding. And it's not something that aquarists will do, commonly. I don't see people breeding Oscars nearly as much as they breed African cichlids or guppies, fish like that, just because I think Oscars don't necessarily have a profitable turnover rate as a home breeder. Plus, you will need a lot of space to breed these fish because they have a lot of babies as well. But it's still a fun project that you might want to look into. Now, Oscars don't really have any physical dimorphic traits for a cichlid. males and females do look the same, and it's almost guaranteed that you won't find any dimorphic traits in captive Oscars because of how misshapen their bodies can be sometimes. And the only real way you'll find out is when the female will drop her egg tube. It's a little pink tube that she'll drop out of her vent, which indicates she's ready to lay eggs. You'll also see a pair, a male and a female, doing some courtship spins, and they'll find a surface in the aquarium like a smooth river stone or some driftwood that they'll start fanning and cleaning off so their female can lay her eggs. The male will then pass over them and fertilize them, and one of the best things about Oscars is how amazing of parents they are. They will really guard their fry and their eggs very, very well, so there's not really all that much you need to do in terms of caring for the babies because they will raise them up to a fairly decent size, and seeing the way that the babies all huddle up around the parents and bunch up together is one super cool and very, very cute to observe as well. So as long as you're giving the babies and the parents enough food, the way that these fish eat, they will release all those little bits of food through their gills, which acts as food for the babies. But you can also give them some small sinking pellets or some fry powder that they will just latch up and eat everything really, really quickly. And from there, there'll be a pretty decent size to when you can start selling them. So the one thing that I would probably be willing to do is maybe crossing some of those captive strains that are available. Like what would happen if you crossed a lemon Oscar and a standard tiger Oscar, or a chili and a lemon Oscar? It'd be, cool to experiment with the genetics and see what sort of colors you can come up with. The one final thing I wanted to touch on is just some medications that you might want to have on hand, especially when you're keeping Oscars in a group or communal setting. The first thing I'd always do after I get a new Oscar is just to deworm them with something like praziquintal or levamisole. You can call me pedantic, but these fish are often raised in the thousands, in farms, in close quarters, and diseases, internal parasites, they can all run like wildfire through these fish. If you've ever gone to an aquarium store and you're seeing a group of Oscars in an aquarium where one or two of them have a slightly sunken belly or look a little bit lazy, it's almost guaranteed that even the healthy ones have got internal parasites, and it'll just lead to a slow death after you've brought this fish home. So doing a quick deworm isn't going to hurt the fish if it's already healthy, but it is going to safeguard you from any long-term problems as you're raising it. Now, I'd even recommend deworming Oscars even if you're getting them from a hobbyist that could have had this Oscar for years. You don't know if they're being fed live foods, if they've had an internal parasite over an extended period of time, or what sort of diseases are present in their aquarium. So again, a really great way of safeguarding your Oscar is just by deworming them once you've got them. Secondly, I'd recommend having some sort of antifungal, stress relieving or healing medications on hand. Ones that I always like to have on hand are things like API Stress Coat or Easy Life Vugal. I know that Fritz has similar products to this, and the reason for that is because, like I mentioned earlier, almost always you'll find your Oscar getting into squabbles, scratching itself, tearing up a fin, and by dosing something like Stress Coat, you're just ensuring that the slime coat of these fish is really at its optimal level, which will just stop and increase immunity against diseases, but also just help with the healing of these fish a lot faster. The last thing you want is something to fungus over, lead to some sort of secondary infection, and then cause ill health for your Oscar long term. To take this one level higher, you can also have some methylene blue on hand, and that's again for that antifungal property, but also if you ever encounter something like ick. Oscars are often susceptible, especially when they're kept in poor water conditions, to ick and velvet. Methylene blue is a great way of warding those off. You can also have aquarium salt, which will effectively do the same things, but I like having methylene blue just because it's pretty strong and it will get the job done, but aquarium salt will effectively achieve the same thing. Oh man, okay, well that is pretty much everything that I can think of when it comes to caring for these Oscars, and I have spent way too much time preparing for this video and really just recollecting everything I've learned over these years keeping these fish. Trust me when I tell you, you will love keeping Oscars, and there are fish that once you get, you can pretty much never stop from keeping. Even if you end up rehoming an Oscar, you'll end up getting one a couple of years down the line. They always keep coming back into your life, and there's a point in time where you'll decide, okay, no matter how many times I try, I'm always going to have an Oscar, so I might as well just get a group and settle with them, which is kind of the stage of my life where I'm in now. I'm always going to have Oscars, and I'm super happy with these wild ones that I've got. Now, if you ended up enjoying this video, and if you stayed up until the end, I really did want to give you a massive thank you. If there's anything that you wanted to point out, or you feel like I've missed, or things you wanted to add about Oscar care, feel free to let me know in the comment section down below, because the comments are a really great way where us experienced aquarists that have kept a certain fish can really share our knowledge to people who are learning or would like to get these fish in the near future. So I'd love to hear your insight and input in the comment section down below. Again, if you could give this video a thumbs up, we'd highly appreciate it, and you have the option to subscribe to the channel as well. But Bodgies and Widgies, thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay happy, stay safe, stay Aussie Australian. Bodgie out.